We'll invite you guys to sort of discuss amongst yourselves. I'm going to sort of step back, and I'm sure you guys have lots of questions or thoughts to bounce off of each other's. I've got a list of my own questions, but I'll invite you guys to have a conversation.
Straight off of Kelly's comment. Do we need a microphone?
That little, and it should pick up in a moment. It needs a second to
Oh, see, they have that one.
we're basically in a big classroom, so it's, yeah.
We can't see much over here.
Okay.
So, Kelly, so you made a very important comment about the gap between the... There you go. Okay. The gap between people who are being treated as experts when they're not, they have experience, right? The teachers and police officers, and then getting the experts such as the mental health professionals to comment as experts. One of the challenges I've had in working with the media, and one of the reasons that I was refusing, until I actually met Mark Fullman, refused to do media interviews, is because the way that the media handles the mental health expert, an incident happens, an attack happens, they want someone to speculate on a case, to be the quote-unquote talking head, and it's not intelligent reporting, it's not thoughtful reporting. It's what is going to help them get the viewership that day. So I refused to participate in media interviews until I met Mark and actually learned about his work and liked him as a person and knew that he's doing the right thing in being thoughtful in his reporting. So I participated in 4 articles with Mark over the past couple years. And I recently did a piece with Scripps Media that was a 30-minute special on preventing mass shootings. Otherwise, I don't want to be treated in that knee-jerk response when the media needs someone right now. I want to be able to participate in thoughtful reporting. How do we move the needle with the media to do more thoughtful reporting and less knee-jerk reporting?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is to establish relationships ahead of time, which is easier in a local environment, right? But if you're working in a local environment and you care about this issue, you will be knocking on the door of your local television stations and your local news organizations, the newspapers, including the Alt Weekly, the main newspaper in town, and then any bloggers in town that have any sizable audience as well. And you'll be introducing yourself and you'll be saying, hey, you know, can I have 20 or 30 minutes of your time? I want to just talk to you about, there will come a time when we will have something that happens that you will be making connections between mental health and violence. Let me tell you what I know now. Let me give you my cell phone number so that you can call me whenever you need me and you'll get me quickly. That's the best way. And that was, I mean, the very first thing I started working on when I got to Poynter was sexual assault. And I found deep, deep distrust between the people who are experts and who understand sexual assault as a public health issue and the journalists who cover it for exactly that reason, on top of the fact that they thought that the media was always going to do further harm to the victim. But what I found was that there is an overlapping, I mean, you're both interested in the common good, and if you can establish that relationship ahead of time. And then I think in addition to that, as an expert, I think that you can learn, there's a skill, because the media do this with me all the time too, right? There's some particular case where the media maybe reported something wrong and they want me to comment on it, but I don't know anything about that, right? Other than what the reporter on the phone tells me, and I have no idea of knowing if that's accurate or not. And so what I always, always, always say is, I can't comment specifically on this case, and I really want you to respect that. However, there are some broader concepts that are, or principles that are at play here, and let me talk about those. And I think that that's a move as an expert that you can take with a journalist that's trying to peg you to a story that you don't have enough information to comment on right now, or maybe even trying to get you to do something else that's inappropriate, because I know that happens. You know, I'm not going to make excuses for journalists who don't deserve to have excuses made for them.
Thank you.
Well, I had, I mean, I think Kelly you and I maybe are on different sides of the specific related to the naming and the publishing of the photos of offenders. And so I thought that might be interesting to discuss. I do agree, and I think I'm glad you emphasized that journalistic motivation is often the public good, public safety, public health. The fact that so many media members get into this because they want to make the world a better place. And that very much reflects my one-to-one interactions with media members as well. I guess where it seemed like we differ, it was a little bit puzzling to me. On the one hand, I guess you mentioned a Voldemort effect, which was, that's based on Harry Potter, right? Which was fiction, but...
What was a metaphor?
Right, but I guess the point is, well, but Mark or Russ, tell me if I'm wrong, I don't think there's any evidence that we know that mass shooters would become more common if their names were less publicized. Have you seen any forensic evidence of offenders who, if you gave them less publicity, that would actually kind of fuel attacks?
I can comment on that anecdotally, talking to people who work in threat assessment in security setting at the federal level. I've been told about cases where there is an interest in reacting to that, to not being known, to try to, the concern is essentially if you make someone less known, they're going to see that as a challenge. Oh, you're not going to stop me from being known, buddy. Wait till you see how many people I kill.
Right, okay.
And this theory is actually, I've been hearing about it again recently in the context of Las Vegas, which is a very interesting case in this regard. There's so little we know about that perpetrator's background and motivation in some respects. And what we know so far in terms of what's in the public record, there was a deliberate effort on his part to destroy the trail of evidence leading up to his attack. So, and this was someone we also understand to be very smart and who did a lot of planning. So that was an intentional choice. The question then is, well, why? And through what lens of infamy was he looking at the attack? So I think there's some interesting questions around that, and it's complex. I think getting into the question of motive for achieving notoriety through the press.
Well, and I think though, in addition to that, like, even if you could presume that that was true, that not naming would prevent mass shootings, not naming would also cause other harm, right? And I don't know that that other harm is stuff that we would be willing to live with. So, for instance, if I don't name someone, people will try and figure out who that is, and some of them will get it wrong, right?
And we see a lot more of that with social media.
Yeah,
now, right?
they'll get it wrong, and the wrong person will be labeled, and that person and his family, and there will be harm that is caused that way. And then in addition to that, if you don't name somebody, and I think specifically with Virginia Tech, it wasn't until the shooter was named that people in the community came forward and said, oh, he was in my class and I reported him. There's an investigative mechanism where when you make the name public, other information comes together. And I don't think we're willing to sacrifice our ability to know as much as we can about the shooter, and having the name publicly known is one of the mechanisms that happens by.
Right. Well, I mean, that's really where maybe we differ then, because I guess I would say in the meantime, we're sacrificing the lives of all these people who die from copycat attacks and attacks committed by fame-seeking offenders and attacks committed by people who kill more victims. We're sacrificing, because they want to get the media attention, we're sacrificing all of their lives for essentially intangible gains. So in the case...
Democratic gains.
Well, and also,
that's what you're saying, but, and just let me...
Go ahead, please.
So in the case of Virginia Tech, law enforcement is in charge of investigating that case. And I guess I would say they can talk to students, right? They can talk to teachers. They can talk to community members. We have a tremendous amount of investment in those investigations, and I would encourage them to use the name of the offender in doing that. If the wrong person is named, just like if in one of these cases where the sexual assault victim is named, or rather is not named, if somebody on Reddit comes out and says, well, I know who this is, and they're wrong, the media and law enforcement can still correct that. So I guess my sense is the strongest evidence is on the consequences of media coverage of mass shooters. It's not just me who thinks that, it's the FBI who says that, it's the International Association of Chiefs of Police who say that, it's 149 experts who have signed this open letter who say that. We're the ones who are, to use the analogy of cigarettes and lung cancer, we're the ones who are studying lung cancer here. We're not making the product, we're studying the consequences. And I think to assume that the consequences would be worse if we tried doing this differently, I think is frankly just too speculative.
So I want to add a little bit of context here too. I appreciate that we have some different views on this. I think it creates a really interesting debate, and this is an area that I think is ripe for further debate, as I said in my presentation. Another important point I think you need to keep in mind here is the notion of causation of attacks. We know there's correlative evidence of this in some cases, but I don't think we can say that media coverage causes mass shootings, that is the reason someone goes and does this crime. And in fact, there's quite a lot of evidence that suggests that that's not the reason why they do it. It's
as a single cause.
It's an exacerbating factor.
Right.
So I think in weighing the question of proportionality and the public service that's done through journalistic reporting, which is important. I mean, I can tell you from having worked a lot with threat assessment professionals that the work that journalists do to investigate these crimes is very valuable to their investigations and couldn't necessarily happen in a closed loop of law enforcement in terms of scaling public awareness like Kelly is suggesting. So it's a complex ecosystem, and I think when we're talking about what causes the crime to happen, which is the million-dollar question with this subject, it's very complicated and difficult to answer. I think we want to be careful about how we treat any contributing factor to the problem in terms of trying to come up with solutions. As you know, I advocate for a different kind of proportionality with this stuff, but I also agree with Kelly that it's not realistic, nor is it in the public interest to have a kind of blackout type effect. I don't think you could achieve it, and even if you could, it would take away some of the benefits that I think are important to the investigative process.
When you say blackout, though, you mean no coverage of the incidents?
No, in theory that you would
Black out the
that you
name.
would black out the identity of the perpetrator from the public entirely.
Even though we do that with some other things.
Well, I think, as you said, you can find sexual assault and rape victims
Right.
on social media, and it's findable information in this day and age.
So if I may, sort of a hybrid, from blackout versus coverage is thinking about how the coverage is balanced. What was at the time the deadliest mass shooting of the year, there I go, doing ratings. But at the time, earlier last year, it was the Dallas, the football party where a woman had a bunch of coworkers and friends over to watch an early season football game, and her abusive ex came and shot and killed her and several friends. Coverage in one of the local Dallas papers was striking to me. Of all the different ways that story could be discussed, they did mention the name of the shooter. I think they may have had one discrete picture, but it wasn't sort of searching for that most shocking picture that might have been out there. But I certainly didn't do the math, but it certainly seemed that if they dedicated 250 words about the shooter, they certainly had at least 250 words, if not 300 or 500 words on each of the victims and each of the survivors, and not in a glamorized rolling in the gore type of manner of this person with this number of injuries and blah, 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 but this person who had these hobbies and these relationships with their friends and these aspirations and hopes. And yes, it was about their death, but it was also very much about their life and their legacy they left behind. And it was striking to me as sort of powerful, beautiful reporting, and maybe suggested some editorial orientation for that paper, because in the wake of Sutherland, they actually wrote an apology letter to the residents of Sutherland. The town of 600 that lost 26 on a Sunday morning, and the next day had hundreds, or at least scores of journalists flooding the town. Sudden shifts in their population in a very unfortunate way. Other questions and comments?
I kind of want to get back to your research this morning about alcohol and drugs, and it's, the cycle that you were talking about, and you were basically saying, if I was getting it right, that with the clusters of violence, that if you could intercept that cluster, that
Right.
you might be, is there a way that we could tell that story as journalists? And keep in mind that what we need real people and real examples.
You mean if you could tell the story that people who are immediately violent, part of the silly, I don't want to say silly, but one thing is, they got upset and it's all over and that's done. That's kind of one story. The other one is, no, this person is in a burst or in a set of activities. I'm not sure how you tell the story of that, but it's obviously contrasting to the story of violence is an isolated incident that
Random
happens
and
then it's done, and
unpredictable.
it's random and unpredictable, and therefore happens and is done, and the person settles down until they get violent again. And that to me is kind of the story. It isn't a dissipation, of kind of classic analytic theory kind of stuff. He got it out of him, sort of thing. It's much more. It's building. It's fueling itself. There's something. There might be something there, and there might be character types that or patterns. You guys would know more about this than I would, but that to me seems to be the distinction there.
Yeah, because I think if you could make people aware of that, then you could give them tools for interrupting that cycle.
Yes.
Right?
Exactly.
So
That would be the idea.
I just think in terms of public service journalism, that might be
Yeah.
an amazing piece of work.
Well, I think sometimes what you all find in your research is so obscure to journalists. Like I noticed another point you raised this morning in your research about how the set of people you were looking at coming out of the hospital was the most dangerous time, and that was kind of
Yes.
counterintuitive. That's a story waiting to be told, I think, by a journalist. If you can make the connection to a journalist and say, hey, this is why this would be important for the public to know about this, and here's some examples that you could look at, and
Yeah.
there's a story there. So that's the kind of research that I think could be surfaced more around the considerations in public health and prevention that are just simply not known to the general
Yeah.
public or to journalists
Yeah.
even focused on the subject.
Just as an aside, when you were saying that the way to go about this is to go and talk to journalists and stuff, and I work, at the University of Pittsburgh, as evidence here, and we have a very active media relations, and we've done that, and we go out and we proactively go after stories like that. So I resonate to that, Let me just, as long as I have the floor for a second, just a little gut reaction to the lack of culpability for journalists to change their views of you guys have to learn to dumb this down because we're too stupid to figure it out ourselves. I
didn't say that.
No, that's
I said we have.
a slight paraphrase, but there should not be pressure upon us to have to learn science. I didn't go to school for science, but you guys should better figure out how journalism works. Well, I grant you, the scientists and the social scientists in particular have created a million words that don't mean anything, and we talk in them. And I agree with you that we do have to learn how to do that. At the same time, I did have kind of a reaction of because you can't expect us. That's all so complicated for my little mind. It's not that complicated in a lot of ways, And I think part of this does lie on journalism's claim to, you have to get it into our terms because we can't possibly learn that stuff. Why can't you learn all kinds of stuff? We all learn stuff.
Well, the best journalists do. And the best journalists, I think, have time to take complicated concepts and translate them to a general audience. But most journalists, and certainly most journalists who are working at local television stations, which is where most of the public consumes their information, they don't have that time.
Yeah.
And so if your ultimate goal is to change the public perception, you need to look at where the public is consuming its information, and then look at the people who are creating that information, and look at what's doable in a given workday for them.
Yeah.
And in a given workday, I'm guaranteeing you that most television reporters do not have the hours that it would take to understand the complicated concepts behind your research and then translate them into a story. And so, that's not their fault, right? Like, they are operating in a system that is well out of their control. It's not even the general manager of the station's fault, although he certainly bears more ability to change the situation. But local television is a machine that runs on it, that is self-perpetuating. And until the audience stops viewing them, they're probably not gonna change.
But, and tell me if you agree with this, at least my perception, and I said it earlier, is I think journalists are getting better about kind of embracing scientific findings.
Yeah.
Disagree?
What do you think?
I think it runs the gamut. I mean, I think to Kelly's point, sort of a salty riff on the challenge there, right? Which, that's kind of humor we like have in newsrooms. And but the central point is true. I think a lot of journalists working under fierce deadline pressure. You're talking about local TV news or newspaper journalism. It's different than the kind of magazine style, deeper investigative work that I've been involved in more typically, where you can take the time to really understand the science. And then at that point, the mission of the journalist, the way I see it, is to actually be that bridge of translation from academia or other forms of research to the public. That's the challenge and the joy of the work, is turning it into good storytelling so that more people can understand it. But you don't have the luxury when you're on the 5 o'clock news every night or filing for a newspaper deadline. So, that's sort of where the challenge is, I think, that she's articulating. Like, realistically, more meeting in the middle would be great, but there's an opportunity there for researchers to do more to try to cross that bridge and be more effective that way, I think.
Yeah, I just to touch upon this again slightly, is that I think the best advice given to me at one point in my career was, think of talking to a journalist as an educative function, not as a confrontational, don't try to catch me at something, and I think that goes to your journalists have a betterment of society goal, and let's grant that, and then your job as a scientist, and I'm not much of one, but you is to say, okay, well, here's what I'm saying, and here's how we came to that, or something, but it is to educate people.
Yeah, and there is a great skill. We were talking last night about this guy that I do a podcast with. His name is Art Kaplan. He's a medical ethicist, right? But he's genius at it. Like, he's taught me everything I know about this, right? And it's because he can take these very complicated facts and turn them into a soundbite. And people deride him for it. They think that he is pandering. And he gets a lot of crap from his colleagues because he does that. But I feel like he does more to educate the public than most of his critics do.
And I think that sort of highlights sort of our own ethical dilemma, or really, on the science side of, we're used to, the long format. We're used to, the peer-reviewed, blind reviewed, research article that's, submitted in February, and we get the comments back if we're lucky in April or May, and if we're lucky, it's published this calendar year. And it's a very different cycle than the day-to-day news beat, and to try and compress that science where we might take, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 words to really carefully, parse out very specific concepts and ideas, it doesn't lend itself to that 2 or 3 minute stand up for the evening news. And certainly there's something to be said, do we sacrifice some of the precision that the scientist part of our brain really wants to cling to effectively convey and engage both the media and the consumers, the populace at large with these tricky issues. And of course, as I've often said, if this confluence of violence and public policy and mental illness and firearms, if it could possibly be reduced to anything even close to a soundbite, we would have fixed the problem by now. It is a complex problem, and both the colloquial and the scientific sense of the word, and many aspects of it do not lend itself to that short format. I know there's some other formats that are out there. The Conversation website, which allows scholars and scientists to write, in a more journalistic style in an open source way that can be picked up by different formats, and certainly long format journalism. Even Politico has run some very good pieces about, a wonderful piece written by a psychiatrist about why a psychiatrist won't stop the next mass shooter. So there are some intermediate ways, but yeah, I worry about that, trying to capture that
To that point,
evening
Greg,
news.
I would just say that I think it's helpful to think of it not as a zero-sum equation, that, there are tools you can use to try to bridge this gap too, like think of it as, dare I say, like sort of, offering some gateway drugs, like with sound bites, and then, point people to the deeper, more complex research that way. As Kelly was saying, like, well, would you put it on Facebook? Well, what do we see on Facebook? I mean, nobody's posting 3,000-word articles on Facebook. So that's the world that journalists are operating in now too, with our own work and having to get people. We spent a lot of time at Mother Jones thinking about how do we get people to read the really deeply investigated feature reporting that we do. Well, we create a really cool, slick little 1-minute video that everyone will share, and it takes you into the story. You want to know more. I think that those tools can be applied to academic research as well, and bridging the gap with the media. Certainly worth thinking about, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I would just add, Ed mentioned having a great communications team here at Pitt, and I feel the same way at Hopkins, and I'm so grateful because they do that for me a lot of the time, right? As someone who I really enjoy doing, translation work, but I am an assistant professor. Like, I need to publish papers and write grants. Like, that's the reality of my life, right? And so having a great communications team that has science training and has time and also knows how to write press releases and put together the catchy little video that they can put out on the blog and stuff is such a great tool. And so I think that is really important for sort of academic institutions to focus on. Our department has recently sort of built up a departmental level communications team out of recognitions for this, which I think is a really smart, progressive thing to invest in.
Yeah, but what will happen is you do reduce it to an elevator pitch, which is essentially what you're talking about. Is I actually don't think you'll solve the problem even once you can describe it a little more succinctly. And that has not been the case with climate change, right? Which is a similarly, maybe even more complicated problem. Because what you have are political forces who don't want this problem solved. Right, and so what they will do is cloud the science. And if you haven't, there's a documentary, I think it's available on Netflix, it's called The Merchants of Doubt, but it does a really good job of describing how lobbyists and political forces will cloud science in the mind of the public, because all you have to do if you're on the other side, when somebody says, the fact is X, is say, well, the science is unclear on this, and introduce a little bit more doubt into the equation. And so then what we really have to do is create a public that is more literate about the consumption of news and media.
You see the way that's bled into our national politics now too, beyond science. I mean, just that certain undeniable facts are in dispute just because someone says X and someone says Y. I mean, we're in a much more complicated and difficult situation trying to convey information at this point.
Right, and you do sort of have to fight fire. I mean, as somebody, like, I'm a systems analyst, right? And I look at information systems, and you have to fight fire with fire, which means that once you do get it distilled down to to a 30-second, something that's shareable, you need to say it over and over and over again, and you need to keep saying it, and you need to find different forums to say it in, and you need to have the conversation in different places. And too often I feel like what a lot of people who are really smart and intellectual do is they get bored with saying it and they move on to something new,
Yeah.
because the new challenge is what really interested them. And it's like, but nobody followed you, right? Like
It's totally true.
yeah, so you have to create a machine that's gonna say it over and over again.
I think that supports what you were raising about the suppression of gun violence research. I mean, that's something that I covered at length for a couple years, and I never talk about it anymore. And it occurred to me when you were saying that, like, oh yeah, I should keep reporting about this.
Nobody's studying this still,
Right,
right? It's still a
right.
problem, yeah.
So,
Yeah, thank you, Fox News.
right.
Yeah.
Well, so
They do, exactly.
Yeah.
Dig stuff up, and then everybody else has to report
And-
on it.
and look at how much
Yeah.
repetition matters in that equation,
Yes.
over and over.
Repetition matters. We've
I-
learned that.
I almost wonder if, maybe what the field of violence research and threat management needs is a Neil deGrasse Tyson of threat management. Russ. No pressure, Russ.
It's true, you need like podcasts and bloggers and.
Well, I will say, although the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals has been around since 1992, occasionally it is approached, like when Mark came to the ATAP conference in 2015, for thoughtful pieces and thoughtful knowledge. But generally, we, the experts that make up the association, get that same request I had described at the start of our conversation. It's just they want the news bite, and we want to provide thoughtful information. And we don't want to be misquoted or misrepresented. So one of the things that I'm looking at in my presidency with ATAP is if the media wants a psychologist, they go to the American Psychological Association. They want a physician, they go to the American Medical Association. Why does the media not understand that if they want an expert in mass shootings and targeted violence prevention to come to ATAP? Because we don't have that visibility with the public right now. We are a small group, 1,700 plus, of experts who do this, live, eat, and breathe day in, day out. And occasionally, our members will pop up in articles, and some of them were mentioned today. So one of my strategic vision concepts for the 2 years of my presidency is to look at how does ATAP achieve more visibility to educating the public and the media about there is a solution to prevent these things. We are a group of experts who do this every day. It's just that matter of getting this message to the right folks who know how to convey it, and that's what I've been doing with Mark's work.
You guys need a really good marketing firm, and there's one in Washington that works on causes just like this. They're called the Rheingold Group, and they worked on the suicide stuff. They did
I
a really
think,
good job.
just to add one thing quickly to that too, I think it's worth investing more thought in, from the source side, research, expertise, and threat management, and so on, in how to work with the media substantively to get out what you think is important. I think it speaks to the question of the density and the jargon, but it also, I think, speaks to what you're really trying to get through with the expertise that the journalists are coming to you for, right? So a colleague of yours works in a sensitive position, did this with me very effectively, and said, this is a very important way to contextualize this that I want you to be aware of at the outset of a conversation. And people will do that with an agenda too and try to spin you, but journalists who know what they're doing know how to recognize that. And when it's done authentically, it can be very effective. It was really useful for me in understanding the subject matter when I first came to it, and then telling the story well. So I think that's an important way to think about it too, as an expert in the work of medicine or public health or any other kind of science where you're trying to convey something that you think the public really should know about, that's in the public interest and that they don't know about. Make that clear. Work with journalists to try to get that across. I think that's an important priority. Because otherwise, they're just coming to you with their idea of the story. And a good journalist will know that they don't always know what the story is, right? They're trying to find out what it is by talking to you.
So I'll interject at this point. I'd like to shift to audience questions. By definition of antisocial personality disorder, don't many of the people who engage in either individual homicides or some of those, don't they almost by definition meet that? And can we sort of parse out a little bit about the meaning of mental illness in the context of violence, and how we make some of those classifications. I know I have some comments, but I imagine Eddie may
I was
have.
going to say, you're probably better suited to do that than I am.
Okay. Well, yeah, I guess what I'll quickly say is, there's this broad, set of terms that get pulled together under mental illness. And what, as was pointed out very clearly earlier, may not be quote unquote mental wellness. It might be something else. And a lot of it gets sort of lumped together. I read one article that was actually, I think very much a misread of the Mother Jones database, where they said, look, this case has evidence of mental illness because, there was a neighbor that described them as odd or weird. I don't know what my neighbors think of me, but I'm sure at some point in my life, some of my neighbors have had some comments about that. And I don't know if that's really, it certainly isn't anything that I think of as a diagnostic criteria for mental illness. It's 1 in 4 people live with mental illness. It's not a very narrow category. I think often in the public discourse and that media wave, thank you, Dr. McGinty, safe travels. So, I think what's always sort of implied when we hear things, this must have been another deranged person, another person with mental illness. The problem is always mental illness. I feel, and maybe this is me making it a little more personal as a crisis and emergency psychiatrist, that what they're implying is that this person must have or should have had something that if they were in front of me, in a clinical interview, say, this is someone who I want to hang on to at my crisis center. This is someone that maybe I want to start a medication on or treat or maybe even hospitalize. And, often when we actually look at these cases, whatever else might be going on, we don't necessarily see that. And then we can sort of even delve into it even further from a forensics perspective. The level it takes to meet criteria for a diagnosis versus the level, where you get to substantive impairment, the level that might meet the legal criteria for not guilty by reason of insanity or not competent to stand trial, become increasingly higher levels with increasingly narrow populations. And even folks that I think most of us would, in a general sense, agree, this is a person who's got some pretty significant psychiatric issues, may not ever meet some of those more airy, limited criteria that are out there.
So how do we talk about people then? Because as journalists, we are always struggling with, you come in after the fact, somebody's done something, and you're trying to reconstruct who this person is, and you talk to a lot of people and they describe behaviors that are clearly unhealthy. And I think that that's the challenge for us as journalists, is how do we take those behaviors and not diagnose or overdiagnose something that hasn't happened, but still accurately convey that, here's what was going on with that person, so that the public can understand.
Well, to that point, even a description of behavior can be interpreted in a tricky way. I was thinking during, now that Dr. McGinty's gone, we can talk. No. During her scenario, in that hypothetical scenario she wrote, one of the lines was, basically before this guy committed the crime, that he seemed to be talking to himself, right? Mm-hmm. And so is that talking to himself in the way that people do that all the time, or is that read as schizophrenia by a reader? It's a tricky thing because you could describe it accurately, and yet the reader could jump to conclusions.
Well, the stereotype, of course, in the context of mass shootings is that you have to be crazy to do this, and that's just not true. I mean, there are many cases where the perpetrators of the crime know exactly what they're doing, are logical, have a very orderly sense of the world, and have different behavioral reasons for why they're doing it, or different motives for why they're doing it. So I think that it's interesting. I was thinking about the debate we're having about not naming or showing the picture. If you think about the Sandy Hook mass shooting, it may have been far more damaging, all the stories that said Adam Lanza had autism, right? I mean, think about what that did to the autistic population in terms of the inference of how that caused the crime, which I think is how a lot of people read that. Very dangerous, much higher stakes in that particular example than naming him or showing his picture, I think, from what I've seen.
It's hard to quantify that, though, right? Because, I mean, there are people who said they imitated the Sandy Hook shooter and killed people, right? But it's unclear how you quantify the damage of giving Asperger's a bad name or autism.
Oh.
I mean, I think it's bad too, I agree.
One way to quantify, a few years ago, there's a piece in, I think it was the Australian New Zealand Journal of Psychiatry, talking about the impact of media stigma around mental health issues. And they were actually talking about the impact of US media coverage on stigma issues in Australia and New Zealand. And I realize it's a, global information system, but just the thought of, oh my gosh, our media colleagues are doing this in a way that's it's actually impacting on the opposite side of the road. That, I think, I always think back to that. I want to keep moving through because we've got a lot of wonderful questions. And so this one, again, to come back to the context, mass shootings account for a small sliver of the violence toll that's out there in our communities. So much more of it's meted out, those one-to-one shootings. Is there anyone out there who's working on gang violence reporting and any sort of best practice or disparities in how they talk about gang shootings or urban crime or in showing images of African Americans as criminals? So.
There's a lot of conversation about that. There are dramatic disparities. There always have been. Always have been. I mean, when I got out of college and went to the Cleveland Plain Dealer as a police reporter in 1988, and it was a time when in Cleveland there were close to 300 murders a year, right? Chicago doesn't even have that now. And it was at that, those of you who study violence and crime know that there was a big spike in the 80s around violence, and it had been going upward as a trend for several decades. And we covered hardly any of those. We just didn't even cover them. And it was and so what I'm getting at is that the media doesn't make decisions as a monolithic group. We make decisions based on what we think our audience is interested in, and often those decisions are predicated on assumptions about what our audience finds valuable in terms of crime stories and lives, right? So the assumption that the Cleveland Plain Dealer was making at that time was that that murders inside the city of Cleveland were not as interesting as murders outside the city of Cleveland in the suburbs. And that was because when they looked at their subscription data, they saw that there were many more subscribers outside. So and there were also racial assumptions that underpinned that. And that was, I think, those are harmful assumptions. But you can't generalize that to a national level. On a national level, the media make decisions on a completely different basis, often predicated on business and racial assumptions, but for different business and different racial assumptions. And so it's really hard to have the conversation on a national level because each of these organizations is making decisions about what stories they cover for different reasons. But the cumulative effect of all of these decisions are that there are significant racial disparities on how we talk about crime and how we cover crime, and as a result, how the public understands crime. And that is a significant harm that collectively we cause, but individually it's very hard to fix. But we talk about it all the time, and we talk to news organizations about their decision-making process and surfacing bias and racism in their news coverage so that they can counter it. And most news organizations, when they realize how those forces are impacting their choices, want to change it. But then you look at declining resources, and we tell fewer stories overall, and it becomes very difficult.
Just to add to that, I guess my experience anecdotally, not empirically, is also like within a minority community, if you have a gang shooting that kills another gang member, it may get less attention than a gang shooting that kills an innocent bystander. A 4-year-old girl, right? Even though both are tragic, right? One is seen as kind of more tragic and maybe more of a threat to the public or the media consumers.
I think there's someone who wanted to ask a question out loud, Shannon, and then I'll repeat it into the microphone. Yeah. Yeah.
It was kind of entertaining what you guys were talking about as a whole panel. So it had to do with putting a person's name in the media who engages in these types of horrific acts and all that. So in response to that, I was thinking about maybe the benefits of putting that person's name in the media if they're motivated by notoriety. Because if that's the case, they're already engaged in the act. Well, now we know who the person is. We know their MO. So if anything, it might be to our benefit in the sense of being able to monitor, mitigate, and deter him from doing it again.
Oh, if he's still alive.
Yeah, right, so if we don't put his name in there, right, we don't put his name in there, but maybe that's what I'm not, if we don't put his name in there, he might want to try harder. But, you know, whether it's in the media or not, if it's not in the media, at least we know as the professionals who the person is, what their MO was. So could it not be to our benefit in that we know who it is, we know their MO, and if anything, it can help mitigate so as they do not reoffend.
So for our online listeners, this is a question about, you know, when the event is not complete, when something is known about the assailant, and there's ongoing threat or risk in the community, you know, is it appropriate then to share some of the identifying information about the offender, that, you know, name or image and so forth? And,
Yeah, I mean, I just think about, there's some interesting research on looking at generations of Americans and looking at American values across generations. And one of the things it shows, which I assume a lot of you probably kind of have intuited already, is fame seems to be growing as a cultural priority, particularly for young people. So the Pew Research Center, for example, did surveys which found that, this was 10 years ago now, that 51% of people age 18 to 25 said to be famous is one of their most important goals in life. And so I guess what I would say, and you know, some of us may disagree, is that if you can shut the door to mass shootings being a source of fame, a guaranteed source of fame, they'll still pursue fame, and maybe even in unhealthy ways. But at least they won't be killing people. They go on reality TV instead. So.
So one of the questions here is, given this important topic, given this important topic, do we have local media here today? And if they aren't here, why is that? Anyone willing to self-identify as local media? Is that you, Megan? Yeah, thank you. All right.
Get her. Sorry.
So, you know, and I'll say just, you know, from a back of the house perspective, you know, Lisa and I worked very closely with our partners at UPMC and Pitt Media Relations. We really worked very hard to get the message out about this and to try and come up with as many different creative ways to invite people here in a way that's not, you know, hey, just cover us because, you know, we want to be famous, but because we feel like there's some important stuff here. And part of this is bringing more science to the dialogue. Part of this is, let me be thoughtful about how I phrase it. Part of this is opening the dialogue about what may be most effective and meaningful in the practice of a journalism, and to do it in a way that's thoughtful, that whereas I, as a non-journalist, as an absolute non-journalist, am not telling people what to do, right? And I don't know, I hope you've been at least a little bit successful in that. I know we do have other media folks, you know, watching via our web feed. So I'm hoping we may have had some of that impact. But, you know, maybe I'll even say, you know, why might media, local journalists not be interested in something like this? I know at least one part of this, Mark and I were talking earlier, there haven't been a lot of slow news days recently, you know, either locally with our gerrymandering issues or some other, you know, there seems to be some national issues going on and shut down or something like that. But, yeah.
Oh, that's a genuine question? Why
Yeah.
would they be interested? I mean, man, their jobs are hard. So if you were working and you're in local journalism, in most cases, your boss isn't gonna cut you loose for a day to come to something like this, because there's not gonna be an immediate payoff. Which means, so then you have to be self-motivated to take the day off. Taking a Friday off in journalism is one of the hardest, and daily journalism is one of the hardest days to take off, because you're about to have 2 days where you're gonna go on to a skeleton crew staff, which means a lot of production work gets done on Friday. So it wasn't necessarily the best. If you wanted local media to come, this was not the best time. In television, it's sweeps, right? Am I right about that? It's sweeps month, right? Right? So in
Oh,
television,
yeah.
it's sweeps, which means nobody can take any days off. So, I mean, if we wanted local media to come, we would have to schedule it at a time that would be a little more convenient for local media.
You know, our parameters as we're thinking about when to schedule this, and as I may have mentioned before, we've thought about this for a while, and in the immediate aftermath of Las Vegas, we're going to go ahead and do it. And some of our parameters, frankly, Fridays, scheduling is a lot easier for us, both here at the law school and also in the medical center. So depending on room availability, we knew this was like an easy target for us. That's one of our very simple operational considerations. And we're also looking at some of the other time-based parameters. We were worried about December, knowing that it was the anniversary of Sandy Hook Elementary. We were worried about doing it too close to March, which is the anniversary of the Wilkinsburg shooting, as well as the anniversary of the Western Psychiatric Institute and Clinic shooting. And then at the most crass basic level, my program, Resolve Crisis Services, were under the umbrella of Presbyterian and Western Psychiatric Institute and Clinic. And we've got Joint Commission rolling up on us any day now, maybe Monday. And so I had to pick a week that we knew Joint Commission wasn't going to be doing their own investigative journalism on our program. So, okay. We had a number of questions related to HIPAA and privacy laws and how that impacts our ability to protect society, especially given research about recent hospitalization as a risk factor. Certainly we know about concerns about sharing information from hospitalization back to the community, especially for family members. After some of these events, I didn't know if Ed or anyone else cared to comment on those issues.
Yeah, I think that is a real concern, and those are boundaries, but I have been to several analyses of the HIPAA regulations, and I'm kind of coming away with the idea that there's a way around a lot of that stuff if you structure the system to do it. I think it makes sense. You can't call up and just ask for somebody's record, and are they in the hospital, and what do they have, and when are they getting out, okay? But there are ways for agencies to coordinate information that I think are generally untapped. And unfortunately, I think that the HIPAA, the claim of HIPAA not letting us share information is a little overblown and oftentimes taken by providers and by criminal justice agencies as a way to just shut down the amount of work that has to go into really sharing that information. I mean, that's kind of a cynical view, but I think that's oftentimes what happens.
And I think what I'll offer, folks who know me know, I spend a lot of time on HIPAA and privacy and duties to third parties. HIPAA was never designed for that single high-risk person of concern that maybe law enforcement is centering in on, emergency mental health or outpatient is centering in on, and we're trying to figure out what to do at 2 a.m. Is this person safe? Do we have to make a warning? Do we have to make an intervention? It was designed for some idiot who has a thumb drive with 20,000 records on an unencrypted thumb drive that they leave at Starbucks. It was never intended to operate at the scale of, I'm really concerned about Mr. Smith tonight. When you get into the nitty-gritty of HIPAA itself, it says there is permission to warn as long as it's in accordance with state standards. Our state standard is Emmerich versus the Philadelphia Center for Human Development, 20 years old this year, and with all due respect, but I don't mind saying it on the record, not our state Supreme Court's best work. I don't know if any of my law students are left in the room, but we'll talk about it. You may see it on the exam. So, yeah.
I think there are other ways to get the information you need besides requesting medical records.
Yeah.
My job has been my career has been focused on consulting with investigators. So I never have face-to-face with any victim, witness, or suspect in a case. That's what my special agent does, my investigator does. And I will front load them with the questions to ask to understand the context of a mental illness diagnosis or a violence risk factor. When they go out and gather the information, they can talk to the spouse or a sibling or a parent and ask those questions. They're not requesting a medical record, but they're getting all the information that I need to still understand the context of that mental illness, that diagnosis, that violence risk factor. And when they are actually dealing with clinicians, I train them on, yes, the clinician will say, I can neither affirm nor deny Mr. Jones that I even know who that person is, much less that they are being seen in my clinic. And I say, that's okay. The clinician's job is to not disclose the identity of their clients. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't go ask the clinician anyways and say, hey, I'm not asking you to confirm or deny this person is your client or patient. I'm letting you know that I know that they're being seen here because his wife told me that. And I'm letting you know these are the things that I'm finding in my investigation that make me concerned about violence risk. I'm front-loading you with this information so that you can decide right now if you have a terrorist-off warning, a duty to warn me now, and if not, now you know what to watch for if something comes up in therapy that is a piece of the puzzle. Now the puzzle's together, we know that the risk is there, we know that he's going to get the gun and he's going to shoot this person, and now you can issue the terrorist-off because before you were handcuffed by the information that your client was sharing with you in therapy, in downplaying it or minimizing it. This is the rest of the story. And that's helped us, in cases, actually put the pieces of the puzzle together and then intervene to prevent the attack from happening.
And at a practical level, again, as a practicing psychiatrist who works in the emergency and crisis field, if we could actually reduce it to such a simple, maybe, false dichotomy of, do we have a lawsuit and have to write a check because we kept confidence in someone who went on and did something, horrible and violent to someone else? Or do we breach confidentiality and write the check for the breach of confidentiality because we were so concerned that this was a case in the Grace? If I could control, I'd rather apologize for breaching confidentiality. I'll tell you, in my position, not all of my decisions are that easy. I'd rather there not be a risk or a harm or at all at the front end and certainly at the back end. I wouldn't mind bypassing a few lawsuits. But boy, if I could choose, I'd rather take the ethical and frankly the legal hit for the breach of confidentiality than for that harm. But by the way, at my level, I'm swimming in the deep end. I get to make those decisions, but I also take those risks. And sometimes, part of my role is to be the person on point to make the decisions that we may not want other people to make. So. We're going to do one last question, and then I think we're going to begin to wrap up. We have a number of questions we won't get to, and I apologize. Did we want a verbal question?
We have one other question or comment.
Sure.
Briefly.
Sure.
Curtis.
Dr. Pereira, so some of the information you gave about looking at risk assessments, even talking about models that high schools and middle schools could use. In the community, if we accept the premise that more people or less people read newspapers and have less times either for issues of literacy or access to newspaper or money, investigative in-depth journalism might be good for those folks who aren't dumb enough to be able to, or who are smart enough to be able to understand that. But for the other folks who want to have a question, why is this happening in my community? Why are these shootings happening? Why are so many epidemiological gang shootings happening? What can we do to stop it? It seems to me, given what we're saying, what we know about readers of journalism versus watchers of TV, it would behoove an ethical, moral imperative for those mediums of information and education for the public, i.e. TV, local or national news, to come up with ways of taking models that you have studied and what Dr. Mulvey has said about violence and educate and have issues on that kind of setting if they really truly want to educate and inform the public as opposed to sell soap. So I understand the business model. I understand what drives commercial and local TV. But if you're not doing your job of providing information and education, that helps the wellness of the community and to understand what's happening, then that is not journalistic moralism, in my opinion. That is simply doing the business commercially of selling products.
Thank you.
There's more than one way to get the word out into the community, and I appreciate that point very much. I would reference a community policing model, specifically for law enforcement agencies that have gang intelligence units, and use community policing models to have cops out on the beat, building relationships with folks in the communities, specifically directly with the gang members themselves, getting to know them, hanging out with them, building relations, and then asking for information. Oh, you know, so-and-so is going to put a hit on so-and-so. What's that about? Why are they going to do that? When is that going to go down? And that's messaging that is not being done through journalism. That's just person-to-person, good old-fashioned relationship building. And my role is to train law enforcement in understanding these threat assessment models so they can go out and use that community policing model, gather that information, assess when risk is increasing between two people and someone's about to go put a hit on someone else, and then prevent that attack from happening using their law enforcement authorities. So completely agree, and we need to use multiple methods for getting the messaging out there.
Okay. So our last question here is, why do you think the news media creates a stigma around mental health when talking about gun violence, but at the same time they're also encouraging breaking that stigma when reporting on, you know, say student athlete suicides or well-known athletes and celebrities struggling with mental health issues? It seems like the news media sort of has contradicting values there, and I'm curious for some comments about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think society has contradicting values. I think that we're seeing the stigma around mental health move. A lot of it is around the younger generation coming up that is much more willing and open to talk about mental health issues than older generations and to talk publicly about them. A lot of it is that we've seen, I mean, when you talk about, there's some specific populations like the elderly and mental health, we've seen some statistics come out that have prompted some stories, veterans and mental health issues. So I think that the news media, it's hard to talk about, again, a monolithic news media, but I think for the most part what you see in the news media is a mirror of society, which is that we have conflicting messages around mental health. And so then when you're talking specifically about the local daily news media and the stories that they choose, well, I mean, they're just trying to find stories every day about what happened yesterday in your community or what's happening today in your community that you might find interesting tonight. They're not necessarily thinking about, do we want to change public attitudes about mental health? And I know many journalists who would even reject that notion that our idea is that our job is to change anything. But I don't think that that would stop. You know, it's such a relentless business. It's just so intense that there's not a lot of thoughtfulness. And I regret that, and it's one of the things that we, you know, as a nonprofit organization, try and improve. But
well, one thing I would add too is I think, you know, you do see, I think, a significant level of media coverage of other kinds of gun violence going on in urban communities and where there are large populations of people of color. You know, the Chicago story that's sort of the perennial boogeyman of violence, of gun violence. I think part of the challenge there is that some of these other issues that surround this problem, which is very complex in terms of causation, whether or not it's gang focused, there are other things going on too. It's socioeconomic more broadly. I think there's probably a lot to be done on mental health issues in those communities too. I can't recall seeing stories about that, you know, to the subject matter we're discussing today. And I think there are some very entrenched ideas about what the gun violence problem is that are distorted in some ways. I've thought a lot about why there's such inordinate attention on these public mass attacks when there's such a small fraction of the gun violence problem. And part of it has to do with, I think, the way that it is an assault on the sense of security for the public. It's very, perhaps the most terrifying example is the one that you can't explain. Like, why on earth would someone do this? And it seems random, right? So I think that causes an inordinate reaction in terms of the coverage. But that said, I think if you were to survey the room about who is the mass shooter, what is the profile of that, a lot of people would say it's a young adult white male. And there are many cases like that, but by no means is it exclusive to that. And I think that's one of a number of misunderstandings about the problem that starts to translate into other ways we can study it in different communities. If you go just by the metric of carnage, of casualties, body count, there's lots of mass shootings going on that revolve around different sets of motives that are worthy of our attention and study. That don't get the attention, I think, because there's this ingrained idea that it's only the schizophrenic white 28-year-old male who does this, and that's just simply not the case. There are many cases where that involve African Americans, that involve Asian people, that involve Latino perpetrators. So I think it's just really important to kind of look past the stereotypes, and that's important for the media too, to not get stuck in this narrative that everybody thinks is the truth, the capital T truth, or I forgot which one, the small t truth, of the matter, and then just keep going over and over that way. It's there's more room, I think, to challenge our assumptions about this problem, including more of a focus on some of those surrounding issues in communities of color that might be related to the gang activity that's resulting in a lot of gun deaths.
Okay. And at this point, we must draw to a close. On behalf of Lisa Parker, the Center for Bioethics and Health Law, and myself, I want to thank our speakers who've come in from all across the country to join us today. I want to thank our sponsors who made this possible for all of us. And I want to thank you, our audience, to come and join us today. I hope we've been able to deal with this very sensitive, often polarizing, but very important topic well. I hope we've been able to give you some useful knowledge to take back to your work and your lives in whatever domain you work in. Thank you so much for your time and for your interest. As we seek feedback, one of the things that I know we're very interested in is what should we cover next year? We'd sort of thrown this around almost as a joke. Let's say, hey, what are we going to do for round 2 next year? We want to do round 2 next year, and we're not quite sure what the content or format of that will be, but we're eager for your guidance on that. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful weekend.